To understand China's view of itself and its place in the world, we need to know at least a bit of the country's history. While most outside of China think of Chinese history, it's probably the Mao period that springs to mind. The birth of the communist state, the Cultural Revolution. But this is not the era that's shaping current policy. In fact, in the scheme of things, it was just a blip, an aberration even. We need to look back at least a couple of thousand years to understand the bigger picture, because that's what's playing a big part in China's strategy now and the country's changing relationship with the rest of the world. Here's a whirlwind tour of 4,000 years, covering the bits we think are most relevant for today. If we go back to the earliest days of what we might call China, before the Great Wall was built, and before it even became a unified state, we can see the foundations of what the country later became. Confucian views dominated, with an emphasis on benevolence and shared responsibility for public welfare. About 200 years later BC, the main body of what we now call China was united for the first time. This was hugely significant because it then became vital that people across such a vast area could communicate with each other and trade on terms that everyone understood. So standard weights and measures emerged. There were coins, standardized Chinese characters, even axle lengths were consistent. A professional bureaucracy was formed based on competitive exams. Over the 400-year span of the Han Dynasty, there was peace and massive technological progress.
Everyone knows we've got Chinese inventors to thank for gunpowder and fireworks. But around 2,000 years ago, there was a great flurry of innovation. Paper was being used in China more than 1,000 years before it took off in Europe. The same goes for the printing press. Fine porcelain was being produced. China from China. Silk production, early steel production, irrigation and more efficient farming.
In the West, meanwhile, the great thinkers of ancient Egypt and Greece, and Aristotle in particular, were the driving force behind the way society was developing. Arguably, Aristotle's view on the need to protect the common good weren't that different from those of Confucius. He believed benevolence was morally right and that the interests of the community took priority over the needs of the individual. The growth of a professional bureaucracy in China helped unify what was a vast nation. It led to an emphasis on public education, a sharing of best practice on important issues like preventing famine. And there was a legal system that protected property rights. By the 18th century, China's internal trade was much greater than that of the whole of Europe's. China was also trading around the region, exporting sophisticated products in return for primary commodities. Visitors to China witnessed advanced manufacturing, competing producers, and high levels of education. China at this stage accounted for 1/3 of global GDP. It's about half that level now. Whilst the desire for unity was at the heart of what drove progress in China, the opposite was true in the West. The fall of the Roman Empire led to centuries of wars and plunged Europe into what we now refer to as the Dark Ages. And it wasn't until the 18th century that Europe managed to close the technological gap with China.
Yes, this is all ancient history, but it's important to appreciate China's long and rich heritage in trade and in innovation. It was a major influence, and this goes a good way towards explaining how China now sees itself. But of course, the road hasn't always been smooth.
The Industrial Revolution began in Europe, and suddenly the tables were turned. The West rapidly caught up with China, both in military and economic terms. Vast population growth led to a struggle to feed the Chinese people. There was corruption and rebellion, and China went from being at the forefront of technological progress for millennia to being relatively underdeveloped. To add to the shame, the Opium Wars in the mid-19th century led Beijing to cede sovereignty of Hong Kong to Britain. The end of the Qing dynasty, the last emperor, ended 4 millennia of imperial rule. The 1930s and Second World War brought more humiliation to China, this time at the hands of Japan. An estimated 20 million Chinese perished in the 8-year conflict. An internal power struggle led to civil war in 1946. All this turmoil came at a price. While the West's share of global GDP had more than doubled in 150 years, China's share had halved. It had rapidly become a backwater. So when the Communist Party formed the People's Republic in 1949, there was determination to redress what's seen, even now, as a century of shame. Of course, we all know what happened next. From the mid-1950s, China's economy was centrally planned by the state, run as if it was a single factory. Policy-induced famine led to tens of millions of deaths. And by the time Mao died in 1976, China accounted for under 3% of global GDP. Its share of world trade was next to nothing.
The World Bank estimated that in 1981, 84% of the Chinese population lived on less than $1.25 a day, and 98% of them lived on less than $2.
When Deng Xiaoping emerged as China's new leader following Mao's death, he set about implementing a massive policy of reform, opening up the economy and re-engaging with other countries. He encouraged foreign investment and set up special economic zones. The Shanghai Stock Exchange reopened in 1990, 41 years after it had closed. Make no mistake, this was not a free market economy, but rather capitalism with Chinese characteristics. And now there was a balance between the invisible hand of market forces and the visible hand of regulation. Progress was swift and growth has been sharp, but from an extremely low base. GDP has flourished. Life expectancy has shot up. When China hosted the 2008 Olympics, 4.7 billion people around the world tuned in and saw the face of modern China. 5 years ago, Xi Jinping became president. He promised to deliver the Chinese dream of sustained prosperity for a growing middle class. And he also implemented policies that positioned China to retake its place on the world stage. President Xi sees himself as leading a new dynasty, and taking China global again will be his legacy or not.